Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rajesh Merchandani. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the United Nations Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this session, which is the high-level session on financing for more and better data. Now, this session is included in the How Far Have We Come track of the forum, which is looking at progress on the Cape Town Global Action Plan. Now, as you will know, one of the objectives of the plan is to mobilize resources to improve data for development. And the plan puts countries firmly in the driving seat. So how to improve data for development at home is supposed to be down to countries. How are they faring? What are the economic, practical, and political challenges involved? And how are we doing at mobilizing more resources to pay, to finance better data for development? Today we'll hear from a range of experts from a range of sectors: developing country governments, donor governments, philanthropy, international financial institutions. What are these actors and their sectors doing to overcome the challenges and unlock finance for development data? We have a large panel. Let me introduce them to you, going down the list. Lisha Delati-Bouder is the Deputy Director General of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. Next to her, we have Niels Plug, Director of Social Statistics at Statistics Denmark. He's also a member of the high-level group for partnership coordination and capacity building in statistics for the 2030 agenda. Hai Shan Fu is the Director of the Development Data Group at the World Bank. Neil Jackson is the Chief Statistician of DFID, the UK's development arm. Stefan Schweinfest, who you've already seen, is the Director of the UN Statistical Division at DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Zachary Mwangi is the Director General of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and also Chair of the UN Statistical Commission. And Sarah Lucas is Program Officer focusing on evidence-based policymaking in developing countries at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. At the end of the session, we'll also invite up Shaida Badi, the Managing Director of Open Data Watch, who you've seen in many sessions at the forum, to give us the civil society perspective on some of the discussions that we've had during the session. There are a lot of panelists. There is a lot to get through. So panelists, I'm going to encourage you to be concise and to the point and jump in for a discussion throughout the session as well. And let's dive right in. The first perspectives I want to get are from countries on the panel, so Jamaica and Kenya, Lisha and Zachary. As we've said, the Global Action Plan enshrines a country-led agenda. So I'm really keen to understand from both of you, and Lisha, maybe you can go first. Right now, what are your priority areas in terms of the need of financing for data? What are the things that you really need to you want to focus on, and what's stopping you on making progress on those areas? And Zachary, I'll get you to respond to the same question as well.
Thank you very much. For us, our top priority right now is to become more efficient. So with the 2030 agenda, the demands on the National Statistics Office has increased exponentially. What we have been doing within our organization is re-evaluating our processes, how we produce information to become more efficient in light of the scarce resources. Because the reality of the situation is, while data is important, we will never get all the funding we want. So we have to ensure that whatever we received from any source, whether it's from the government or from our development partners, that it is put to the best uses. Additionally, for us, one of the challenges that we have been facing is the retirement of key senior personnel. So for us, a priority is the training and capacity building of our staff to ensure that we guard against obsolescence, to ensure that we are staying current, to ensure that we remain a strong statistics office. That is a priority for us. Additionally, a project that we're currently engaging in, which is a priority for us, is restructuring the organization to respond to the current needs of statistics. Our structure was last looked at in the 80s. So right now, we're doing a comprehensive review to see what kinds of staff we need, where do we need them, and how do we make the most efficient use of the resources that we have.
I'm just going to quickly follow up on that. The last restructure was in the 80s.
Yes.
Wow. And so the way we do data has literally transformed since
So,
then.
yeah, so in between the 80s, we've had minor projects where sections have been improved or new programs have been introduced, but we have not stopped to take a major review of the organization as a whole, and that's what we're doing right now.
Right, okay. Zachary Mwangi, in Kenya, what are your priorities there? We've heard from Jamaica. What about in Kenya?
Thank you very much. We are focusing more on building statistical capacity, and we recognize that we need to strengthen the national statistical system, so issues to do with capacity. And we also focusing more on engagement of the policymakers, particularly the politicians, because these are the people who make decisions in terms of domestic resources. So as we are looking also for international or other partners, we're also focusing more on the whole issue of domestic financing, so that we make our politicians to appreciate the value of data. So one of the areas that we are doing that is to ensure that we better communicate. How do we communicate so that we can more or less excite the politicians to fund and give us more resources? Again, we're also focusing on statistical corporations, the South-South. We have a statistical cooperation with Sweden Statistics Organization. We are having we are also about to have a cooperation with the UK, so that we also learn from the best as we strengthen and improve on the quality of statistics.
So just following up with you then briefly on that issue of trying to engage domestic policymakers more, do you find that in all the stakeholders, it's perhaps they that are lagging the furthest behind? Let me ask that again. I know you just put on your headphones. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? You want channel 2?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering, just following up on that point about trying to engage domestic policymakers, do you find, how hard do you find that is to do?
Yeah, it is not very easy, but it's communication. I think the whole issue is for us to communicate better. What we are doing is that even in some of our publications, we are trying to make them more popular so that we come up with popular versions of statistics. It's to ensure that our data is demand-driven. I think that is the missing link. So that if they appreciate that this is the data they need to do their budget, for example, there will be more incentive for ourselves and the statistical society agencies to get more resources. So it's supposed, the issue of communication is very central to the engagement process of policy.
Lisa, just respond on that. How do you...
Yeah. Well, as he was speaking, I can relate exactly to that. We have a fantastic project with the support of Statistics Canada called the Program for the Advancement of Statistics in the Caribbean. And one of the areas that they have been working with us on is communications. So earlier this year, we started to release our statistics using infographics. And to quote one of our board members, they've stopped reading our press releases and the bulletins. They only want the infographics because we find that it's more relatable. We have to adapt, we have to communicate to today's professional. And today's professional is not going to read a book full of tables. And as such, communication is essential. How do we get the importance of statistics communicated to the policymakers? It's critical.
And would you regard that ability to communicate as basic capacity building?
Yes.
That is so. That's one of the key elements of capacity building, strengthening how statisticians communicate, so that we do not communicate with ourselves.
Yeah.
We have a wider audience.
Yeah.
Okay.
I always joke within my office that we need to write our bulletins in English because we tend to write it in statistics. We write for ourselves, and we have to write for regular, everyday people. So we recently introduced an editorial review committee that has absolutely no statisticians on it. We want regular people to understand what we're saying.
As a communicator, can I thank you, first of all? Having sat in a session, having taken part in a panel on data storytelling, you're not the only ones who have addressed that problem or faced that problem. Okay, country representatives, thank you very much. Let's get the perspective of donors and financiers and bring some of our other panelists into the conversation. There's a strong push, as we've heard, to deliver on self-identified national priorities so that the capacity is, as we've heard, more demand-driven and that it addresses recipients' needs. So I wonder, and let's hear from Hai Shan-Fu, from Neil Jackson, and from Sarah Lucas. What are you doing? What can you do differently to respond to that and to close the data gaps that countries say they have? And I wonder if you can also think about this through the lens of, you know, the situation when country priorities might differ from donor priorities. Hai Shan-Fu, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me start by reaffirming bank's commitment, because to support the national statistical system to continue to build data and statistical capacity is one of our core business. And in this age of time, when we are really looking at how to transform national statistical system guided by the Cape Town Global Action Plan, we're really focusing on two tracks of work. One is how we indeed leverage new data technology and institutional change to help transform the conventional data business, to produce the primary statistics so essential for SDGs and the development discourse. And at the same time, we also need to support the kind of collaborative data innovation to allow national statistical system to leverage the new data sources and working with new data partners and to generate that kind of actionable real-time information necessary. So for example, at the bank, under a bank-wide strategic action program, we started by focusing on SDG Goal 1. You know, for just merely 3 years ago, we have 77 IDA countries are data deprived just to have some regular data to help us assess poverty trend and introduce the best policies. And of course, this program has been expanding into other primary data areas, including how we can best support administrative data improvement. And at the same time, we also guided ourselves through a strategy in terms of how to understand and how to make use of big data and create that kind of collaboratives that we can have among national statisticians and private sector and NGOs and so on and so forth. But in all of this, we see our role is, of course, beyond just advocacy and sharing knowledge and providing specialized technical assistance, because as a bank, we have a role of channeling the best possible financing to national statistical systems. As the Paris 21's report repeatedly reviewed, you know, chronic funding gap for national statistical system is a real persistent challenge. But I have to say there are good signs and in the recent years, and that makes me feel hopeful. For example, to support improvement of poverty data, the bank's president committed that will support countries to produce relevant household survey data every 3 years. And that kicked off, thanks to our donor, DFID, $60 million catalytic fund. And in 2 years, 60 million IDA financing went into supporting countries to improve household survey data. And we just published the new estimates of global poverty trend. Now you can see, you know, the number of countries suffering from this data deprivation in this area has reduced significantly. And right now, talking about country demand-driven support, we can see that there's an increase in countries' own demand and express interest in seeking support for improving statistics and data. Right now, as we speak, there are more than 35 IDA programs of a large scale, ranging from 20, 50 to over 100 millions in many countries, including over 22 in Africa. So there's good signs for change. But I think at this time, when we're talking about supporting the Cape Town Global Action Plan implementation to support SDGs, we're talking about huge ambition. So what we must be done differently from before, so this time there will be real change, I think we'll really have to recognize the following principles. One, indeed, is about what data need, and we direct our focus to that. Second, it's not just about more data, more financing, but it's really about predictable, sustainable, longer-term commitment, so that we can indeed not only incentivize increasing domestic investment, but also leveraging the external support, including from private sources. But the third one is that with all of these elements need to come together, we must coordinate. So donors need to coordinate it, to be coordinated in consolidating, pooling their resources to help address the priority data need. At the same time, as development partners, we also need to be coordinating how we implement together any agreed plan in going into countries. And fourthly, I really believe whatever we do, it needs to be connecting the data need as well as the policy program need. Therefore, there will be real impact of what we generate and go into countries. And all of this need to come together to support countries to develop that capacity that they can continue to adapt and eventually become independent in how they fund their own data programs and initiatives. So I just want to mention very quickly what gives me real optimism at this point. Many of you know, on September 23rd or 24th, a group of donors and the countries, and including you, the Chief Statistician from Kenya, at the event, it is about End of Hunger initiative. The ambition is that between now and 2030, less improved data required for ending hunger, which is the first set of goals under SDG, to generate the kind of agricultural statistics that will allow us to look at agricultural productivity and as well as food security. Let's aim for at least improved data in 50 countries by 30. And by doing so, it's about how to integrate different strands of household surveys and farm-level surveys led currently by different international agencies, putting them together, and also donors, Gates, USAID, Germany, Australia, and others coming together to say, okay, if this requires 500 million between now and then, we're willing to put in 200 if you, the bank, can help mobilize at the same time IDA or other domestic investment so that we can go in together with this longer-term commitment for the next 12 years to see real change, real sea change in countries in this area. So here what you see is we're directly addressing country data need for achieving critical SDGs. We're looking at how trust funds and lending could come in together and really to support supplement domestic resources. It's about consolidated donor coordinated commitment as well as coordinated implementing agency. This is World Bank, FAO, and IFAD coming together. And at the same time, we build in clearly in this initiative how those data can be used for policies. This component will be led by IFAD very naturally. But what I'm saying is that the kind of model of financing offer us a lot of new hope. But this is not it. What really gave me the hope is that at the bank, I see, at least at the bank, I'm sure it's also elsewhere, is that we're not just investing in data improvement as a siloed approach. We're connecting that to other simultaneous investment in helping us to build the data architecture in this digital age. So what I'm really happy to see and to share with you, the bank is scaling up its investment in digital development. Bank is working on integrating investment in CRVS and digital IDs for development, and also scaling up our e-government initiative. It's really by integrating this and increasing this investment, we can really bring those countries currently are really on the other side of the digital divide into this and have the digital data architecture to move forward.
Okay.
That's
Hi,
why I see
Shantu.
the progress.
Great. Plenty for us to unpack there a little later on in the discussion, but I do want to bring in a couple of our other representatives from the donor and financier community. So Neil Jackson first, and then Sarah Lucas. Tell us a little bit more, and responding to some of Hai Shan-Fu's points, about how are you responding to country-led agendas, the country demands for what they need. I'd really love to hear more about this kind of predictable financing issue that Hai Shan-Fu talked about. whether it may be something that's relevant to you or not, so don't address it if it's not. But Neil Jackson, why don't we give you a chance to speak?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the World Bank, who have been long-standing partners of DFID in terms of supporting better statistics. In particular, the sort of approach we've been working on together is very much a multilateral approach, and that they're now scaling up support is fantastic news. I think for DFID, our approach has always very much been about emphasizing the importance of statistical offices themselves identifying what are the national priorities for data and drawing up their own plans for how statistics can best address that domestic agenda, and also for donors then to align behind that agenda. And Paris 21 has put together guidance in terms of how this should be done, and that's a very, very important partnership. So that approach is very much how we do it within DFID, but the challenge is how we move forward now in terms of responding to the challenge of the Cape Town Global Action Plan. I think this brings us down to what needs to happen at the country level, and I think I would very much encouraged by what Misha was saying about efficiency, and maybe building on that point a little bit. I think we are in a heavily resource-constrained environment, and so the big challenge is how do we actually make the money that we've got that already goes into statistics go further. At this World Data Forum, I've had some fantastic discussions and heard in many of the sessions about great opportunities for how actually data collections can be done that much more efficiently. There's an urgent need for civil registration systems, but in parallel countries, they're often having their own registers for the electoral roll, for ID systems. There are real opportunities to invest much more efficiently in terms of building systems that can actually meet the needs of a wide range of users. This is the opportunities of the data revolution. I think we've also heard about household surveys. In the past, household surveys have collected rather different sets of information for very specific users and rather a siloed approach. I think we've got great examples now of how household surveys can join up, which means the money that's going into household surveys can go that much further. And indeed, a lot of the data that we've got is actually punching below its weight in terms of its value because of the way we produce it and make it available. And therefore, the great guidance is being produced about how we can have more interoperable data. So basically, we're sitting on a lot of fantastic resources at the minute. We're not using them to as good effect as we can, and therefore a big focus must be how do we actually invest in statistics in a way to save money, and that can go much further. And I think there's a role for DGs and statistical offices actually to develop action plans for how this can be done. So I think these national strategies for donor statistics are good documents, but in themselves they're not really going to speak to policymakers. I think if we identify the opportunities for efficiencies, that's a really important part of the landscape, and DFID would be very much wanting to work with you on that. I think another aspect I'd like to open up, Zachary mentioned the collaboration that the UK is working with the National Bureau of Statistics in Kenya. Statistics Sweden is another bilateral provider of technical assistance and assistance in kind. I think there's a big question in terms of how do these different types of assistance within the country get joined up and coordinated. So as a lot of donors can go in, they sort of say something particular that they want, but how do they join up? So I think there's a need to think about how do we sort of coordinate these activities, and to some extent this needs to be nationally owned. And again, I think donors are willing to work with people in the institutions within the country to make this happen. And also Zachary mentioned the need to engage at a political level, because that's the most important resources that can be made available really are domestic resources. That is where real sustainability lies. But then if that's there, then the sort of principles that the World Bank are putting in terms of how donors might put money in, if there's domestic resources going in, then that's a great incentive for other donors to come in behind that. I think in the country, one final point then is just all these things need to happen in country. But then in terms of the international community, the challenge is really what can we do to support that activity in country? How do we join up at the international level in a way that facilitates that rather than adds to the complicating challenges?
I want to pick up on that point maybe later, or maybe even with Sarah, about the joined-up nature of of assistance from different sources. But a quick follow-up with you, Neil. You talked about engaging with domestic policymakers and the political realities in country. There are other political realities that perhaps you, amongst our panel, face more than others. For domestic donor country development agencies. How do you thread that needle? How do you, when you're making decisions, justify spending in this area than on others, specifically given the scrutiny of decisions that you're making?
Thank you. You raise a very important point. I think within the UK, the fact that we've committed to spending 0.7% of our national income on development assistance is a fantastic commitment. In return, the UK public really want to know, A, that that money is being spent 100% on the right things, and also they want to know that how is that spent also in the UK national interest. I think the SDGs is a universal agenda, and therefore it's in all of our interests to tackle these great global challenges, of which at the heart for DFID is eradicating extreme poverty. I think the UK public buy into that as a challenge, but what they really want to see, if we're going to spend money on statistics, they really want to know how is that having an impact. So the challenge of leave no one behind, we've heard great examples of how data can actually be transformative in terms of putting the spotlight on those people who are invisible. That resonates with people. But we've got to go further. We've got to sort of see how is that data being used most efficiently, both in terms of how it's being produced, but also we need to see examples of how it is in practice. So can we see some of the success stories of how data has had a transformative effect?
Okay, Sarah Lucas, thank you for your patience for waiting. Let's bring you in. We heard an example from one of our previous speakers about, I think it was Haishan Fu talking about the announcement made for 50 by 2030 countries and agricultural data that was made during the UN General Assembly. That was a partnership between governments and the Gates Foundation and others as well. As a major foundation working in the area of development and with your focus on evidence-driven policy making and how to invest in that, what do you take away from the comments of our panelists? And what are you doing, or what can you do differently to make sure that you're investing in the country-led agenda?
Thank you. I think that there's a saying that where you stand on an issue is dependent on where you sit. So I just want to take a moment to explain to all of you in the room where I sit, because it's quite different than where Haishan or Neil sits, for example. So the Hewlett Foundation is a private charitable foundation based in the United States. We are not affiliated with the Hewlett-Packard Company. And we are much smaller in some ways than the World Bank and DFID, but in a few ways we're a little bit bigger. Now let me explain that. We're quite smaller when it comes to actual dollars. So if you look at the World Bank's IDA, concessional lending and grant-making window, or DFID over the last year, they've made disbursements of about $14 billion across their programs. The Hewlett Foundation has made grants over the same time period of about $430 million. So quite a bit smaller in terms of dollars. But when you have small dollars, you sometimes have a bigger set of tools that you can work with. We can be a little bit more nimble, a little bit more flexible in what we support. So while we will never be able to meet the statistical capacity building needs or data gaps that Zachary or Leisha might have, there are a few other things that we can do. We can, for example, help foster cross-country learning. So when the Ghana Statistical Service wants to develop a data quality assurance framework and do that in partnership with Stats South Africa, that's the kind of thing that we can support. It's a relatively small amount of money, but it hopefully has a pretty significant impact for the modernization of the NSO in Ghana. We can foster collaboration across actors who are each working independently. For example, Open Data Watch, Aid Data, and Paris 21 just collaborated together to release some research around how official statistics can be used for decision making. Or we can help organizations that are trying to make statistics actionable. So for example, there's a think tank in Senegal named EPAR, which is working directly with the NSO to leverage the new data from a new agricultural survey to analyze it and then support the Ministry of Agriculture in using that data for decision making. So that's the kind of space that Hewlett can be in, and we have been in for years. We've been supporting organizations that are trying to bring different kinds of evidence into policymaking. Maybe it's data or impact evaluation or policy research, but the goal is always policy influence, right? And so if there's one lesson from decades of that work, it's that investing only in the production of data and evidence isn't enough. And so that's where we come to the question of what should we do differently, or what role can Hewlett play? Because what we are here, I think all of us in this room, to do is to ensure that data are used for the achievement of the SDGs and knowing whether we've achieved. So if you take the target, for example, of doubling agricultural productivity, let's use data to achieve that goal and also to know whether we have. So what do we need to do differently? Well, I'm very pleased to say that Lisha and Zachary seem to already be doing it, because my first recommendation to all of us, including funders, is think like a user, not just a producer. And you know, the World Bank did an evaluation last year of 200 of its statistical capacity building programs and found that only 27 of those projects paid any attention at all to supporting capacity on the data user side. And the World Bank itself, through that evaluation, called for cultivating a user-centered data culture. And it found that after decades of investing in capacity on the producer side, that, quote, the World Bank had not yet formulated a conceptual model for assessing or presumably supporting user capacity. So we all have that obligation, is to think like a user. And so that means not only do we invest in the production side, which must increase and continue, but also the communication side, which everybody here has already talked about. Visualization, analysis. But I want to add a piece, because there are things you can do to increase the incentives and capacity of policymakers to use that data. That is a neglected side of the equation. The most beautiful data might be in front of them, and if they're not motivated to use it because they can let politics override all the time, they might. And so we have to not neglect that part. And I would say that I think we have some work to do, all of us, in this front, because all of the case that we are building about financing statistics and data is developed primarily through the costing exercises of where there are gaps. We have rigorously analyzed where we have tier 1, 2, and 3 indicators. There's country-specific gap analyses. There's multiple costing exercises. But I think that there's a lot of policymakers and funders alike that, despite all of that rigorous analysis, we don't have a visceral sense of what is it that we don't know. And so I would love to see some of our strategizing about funding going into bringing that visceral sense to life. So if a policymaker, a Ministry of Agriculture, makes a commitment to double agricultural production, who's walking into that office and saying, sir or madam, you have set this goal. Here's the information available to you, the data that we have that will help you achieve it. And you know what? You won't be able to answer the following 3 questions because we simply don't have the information. You can't achieve that goal, madam, without this information. We have to make it more visceral for people. So the first is think like a user. It's pretty evident here that people already are. The second one is, again, a lesson that I think taps into this, the topic, the discussion we've already been having, which is to change our mindset a little bit on funding and take more of a portfolio approach to funding. So a portfolio approach analysis might start with, what is the value we're trying to achieve? I think we all agree the value is that policymakers are using data to achieve the SDGs. So how do you allocate resources most efficiently across that? There has been so much discussion here about efficiency, which I'm so happy to hear. So I'm not going to underscore that. It's just to say that you want to think about what might you save in how you collect data so that you can expand your sampling size, you can disaggregate more, or maybe you spend a little bit less on producing new data products and you invest some of that in the use side. So there's hydraulics when it comes to financing, and so we have to think across a portfolio, because what we've been doing to date is looking at all the gaps, adding them up, getting a really big number, and that signals to the world we're not thinking about these efficiencies. So let's all kind of bring that mindset in. So the last thing I would say is that taking a portfolio approach means a few things. If you're looking across a portfolio of actors who are going to help you achieve that value of data use, it's not just statisticians. You work with a lot of other partners. And so they also should be at the table when we're thinking about a broad, comprehensive financing strategy. And it also takes a lot of funders. I hope I've made the point that the kinds of things that Haishan and Neil are able to support in achieving that value are quite different that what funders like I or the Gates Foundation or others, private sector, domestic resources can support. So we have to think strategically about how to match funders to the issues. It does raise a higher bar on the coordination. Because it's one thing for DFID and the bank to coordinate, but if we're thinking across this portfolio, the coordination challenge becomes bigger, but we're up for it, and we're willing to engage in that way and to really sort of see our place in that puzzle. And I think if we don't take a portfolio approach to financing, we'll not only not achieve the full value, we'll leave some folks out, and frankly, I think we will leave some valuable dollars on the table if we don't think this way.
Okay, great. Lots of points for people to come back on later on. Thank you, Sarah. Niels Plug and Stefan Schreinfest, what do you, actually, I want to just get you to respond in your comments to something that Sarah said that was very interesting, which is we don't have a really good sense of what we don't know. So I'm hoping you can respond to that point in your comments, but also wrap into your comments, what does the Cape Town Global Action Plan, what do events like this, how do they make you think about what you need to do differently, what the statistics community needs to do differently? Niels.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm kind of the impatient type, so I think that we actually have done too little at the moment. But then when I have that thought, people that are more sensible than me reminds me of the story of the cat in Alice in Wonderland. Alice turns up at a crossroad, guarded by a cat, and she asks the cat which way to go. And the cat says, well, that depends where you want to go. And if you don't know where you want to go, it doesn't matter what way you take. So we have been using some time to actually, in the high-level group, to map the needs of the NSOs. And that has been, I think, time that we have had to use for that. But now we are kind of there. So I think we need to act, and we need to move fast forward, and we need to have some concrete actions. Now, the new thing in all what we are doing here has to do with the NSOs, and I think it's important to underline that we take every letter in the NSO abbreviation like serious. The N we're taking serious because we want national data. We want to think local but act local, therefore we need local data, national data of high quality. We want it because it's statistical institutions, that's the S. And we want it because they are doing the same again and again and again. And I know that there are people out there that find that that is super boring. We call it time series, and we think it's actually something of high quality. And then we need the O's, we need to build on the organization. They're already there. They're ready to be developed. We don't need to build something from scratch. We do have organizations out there that we can actually lean on in what we are doing. Now, there has so far been done a lot, though, in order to raise the attention of data in relation to the 2030 agenda and the need for better data, including data quality, timeliness, openness, and disaggregation, which I think is super important in relation to the SDGs, the disaggregation, because if we're going to fulfill the leave no one behind goal, then we need very disaggregated data. And the Cape Town Action Plan is a response to what the statistical community think is the strategic framework for strengthening statistical capacity. But it's only the start of the work. In my opinion, we need to go further and to have some concrete steps on how we do bring the work forward. And those steps has somewhat been taken by the high-level group in the paper, Better Data for Sustainable Development. The paper outlines a mechanism that will address capacity building, needs of national statistical institutions and systems, and it provides some guiding principles for that work, and we need that too. Among them, I can mention that it is a country-led approach, the necessity for political involvement, which has already been mentioned here, accountability and coordination. And I think coordination is crucial. Otherwise, we risk the situation that the wheel is invented again and again and again all over the world. Another aspect that should be mentioned is that in this mechanism that we are trying to set up, it will not compete with existing mechanisms, it will actually just complete them. As a member state and as a member of the high-level group, we observe a general agreement in the community of statistics on what is being needed. What we can call for is a concrete, measurable work on the implementation of the work plan. And the paper I mentioned already is kind of setting the frames for that. So in my opinion, the following steps is what we need to take. We need funding for the implementation of the Cape Town Global Action Plan and coordination of the funding. We need to prioritize the capacity building, both on the country level and on the global level. and we need to ensure that we have a secretariat that is working with the funding mechanism that could be an international organization that already have global membership. We have to strike while the iron is hot. While keeping the larger picture on the horizon, we need small, quick, concrete, and measurable steps on how to get there, something that is relatively simple and easy to convey. Otherwise, I am afraid that we can lose the momentum because we have been working on this for a couple of years, and now we actually need concrete steps in this crucial moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, Stefan Strandfest, let's get you to kind of get your first contribution to the conversation, picking up on what you've heard.
No, thank you very much, and I'm really honored and pleased to be in this panel here. I mean, because we have really covered all the dimensions and all the perspectives. I mean, Lisha and Zachary have basically produced the needs. Then we had the international, the funding agencies, and we had the 3 dimensions of funding. It's bilateral funding, international organization funding, and private sector funding. And Niels has sort of outlined what the international community is, in which direction it is thinking. So we, at the UN now, we are sitting in the middle of all of this and trying to make sense of it and trying to bring it all together and reflect what concretely can we do next. And so I think the problem really falls into 2 categories. One is what we all heard about around coordination. I mean, using existing funding most effectively. And that has, again, 2 layers. At the country level, I mean, we want to make the most with respect to a predefined objective. And at the global level, we want to use the funding effectively in the sense that we are not falling all over each other, so that we are all in the same country and all helping the same sector. And there are lots of orphans in terms of countries and in terms of themes. And so that's one problem we need to solve. This is the better coordination. And then the other one is to try to expand the envelope, because we can talk about using getting more bang for the buck, but I think if we are really serious of building a solid information architecture at all levels, local, national, regional, and global, I think we need to also make the argument that we need to invest more collectively. And so I think these are the two challenges. And in an ideal world, what would I do? I would call a pledging conference and put a big pot in the middle and say, please bring all of your checks, and we have a global fund that we can perhaps then administer at the United Nations or the World Bank or together. But this is not going to happen. I mean, it's just the reality that at this moment, I mean, there is not a lot of appetite to invest in a global fund to transfer money from one point to another, and that may not be the best way of doing it anyway. And also we have to realize that most of the money is as part of policy projects. I mean, I just talked to a major donor the other day and I said, we will not give you $1 for statistics, but we just started a big project of helping Vietnam with environmental management. And of course, as part of that project, there is a lot earmarked for improving the information base in the environmental sector in Vietnam. So in a way, I have a little box where I can say, okay, there's somebody active in the environment sector in Vietnam. And so we need to put our information better together. I mean, we will not be able to super manage a fund and the flow of funding, but we can do better than what we do right now, which is basically not much. And I think one of the idea is to just bring people together. I mean, and I really mean that in the largest possible sense. I mean, we need the people, for instance, that are sitting on this podium. I mean, the countries, the producers, the users of information, the different types of donors that have pieces of information, and have to start a dialogue and inventorization of what is actually already happening, what is the assessment, where are we already covering the needs, and where are the really true funding gaps, and what can we do about them. So I think that's one of the contributions that we can do at the UN, and we are thinking of calling a so-called, the Swiss have been so kind to offer their support in January to call what we call a Bern dialogue on a funding architecture, where we would really try to bring all of these stakeholders together and talk both about an assessment of the current situation and what are possible steps in the next direction. And then the other thing that is very important to me, I think, where we need to do a little bit more, is to simply help countries, and it comes back to the communication point, to better make their case for the return of investment. I mean, because the biggest chunk is still going to be domestic funding. Whatever we do at the international level, it's only going to help to supplement and perhaps incentivize and be seed money and so. But the big chunk is going to be domestic funding. And countries, our colleagues in the statistical offices need to be enabled to better fight that fight, in a way, to go out there and make with their own governments the argument of the value proposition, the business case for good information, to talk in the language. Lisha was talking about publishing things in English instead of statistics when you talk to your general users of statistics. Well, here also, if you talk to your government, you have to talk finance. You must not talk technical projects, because then the bankers or the donors will run away. You need to talk in terms of language, return of investments, and I think some countries have made good experiences in this, and we can even share that experience on how to better sell our case to our own domestic users. So that's an area where we, also my office, is planning to make a contribution.
Okay, panel, thank you very much for your initial round of comments. A couple of things that sort of bubbled to the surface for me that I'd like to explore a bit further is this idea of coordination. Everyone's talked about better coordination. And everyone's talked about, well, most people have talked about where you invest and how you invest, using existing money better, and Stefan, you just talked about the need for greater investment. Respectfully, we've known those two things for a while. That's not really news. So what I want to know is what is stopping that happening? What needs to shift to improve coordination on the ground so you get away from the example, Stefan, that you highlighted of project-specific funding that has a little box for statistics. That's not really addressing the systemic problems. And I'd like to get country perspectives on this. What actually needs to shift on the ground? And what can shift as a result of this conference? What can shift by the time we get to Switzerland in 2 years? Lisha, perhaps, and Zachary, would you like to jump back in? And then panelists, don't wait to be asked. Jump right in.
Thank you very much. I think one of the biggest challenges with effective coordination is that everybody wants to be the belle of the ball. Everybody wants to say, my agency did it. It's that, I think, and even at the local level, we have that issue, where everybody wants to be the one who gets all the credit for it. And unless we get beyond ourselves and realize that we're working for the greater good, coordination will never happen. And we've spoken a lot about inter-agency coordination, but sometimes we also have to talk about intra-agency coordination. We've dealt with agencies that have split personalities. You deal with one section, you get good support, they listen, they work well with you, and then you interface with another section of the same agency and you're wondering, is this a different agency? So it's more about getting beyond our egos and realizing why it is we do what we do.
Okay, how do we do that? What's the mechanism to make that happen? What would you like to see? How would you like to see that happen?
So, a good example that I have seen, for example, with the World Bank's Trust Fund for Statistical Capacity Building, where they're forcing us as a country, and I like it, to coordinate. If an agency locally is going to apply to the trust fund, they have to speak to the NSO. They're required to get the endorsement of the NSO. So you don't have agencies going off on a tangent and putting forward a project for statistical capacity building without having us talk about whether or not this is the right project for something like the trust fund. It is a matter of us holding each other accountable. So within the countries, we have to hold the agencies accountable. When you have two different agencies coming at you with the same general project, you have to say to them, look, get on the same page, come back to us with one kind of thing. And with the agencies, you have to force countries, within countries, to work together. So you can't have two different government agencies proposing two similar projects. So it's a matter of accountability and us holding each other accountable, I think.
Going through the NSO would also be right at the heart of the
Yes.
Global Action Plan, because it's putting them right at the heart of it.
And we have to learn, we have to build on the lessons learned from the SDG process.
Zachary?
I think what we need to do also to improve on coordination, and first is to recognize the tools that we use in planning. So we have the National Strategy for the Development of Statistics, for example. In most countries, what we are doing, we are aligning the Global Action Plan to the national strategies, for example. So that is a starting point. Then the development partners and the players, we engage, like we have a national statistical coordination, donor coordination meeting, which is chaired by the head of the National Statistical Agency, so that you put now the statistical agency at the center of the development processes, so that you say these are the activities that we plan. This is based on the global action, the national context. Then from there, you are now developing the plans, the annual plans together. So if there is a partner, we establish the gaps. This is what is supposed to be funded. We have a very good program with the World Bank, for example, where they are funding our priorities. So we agree on results. The disbursement is purely based on results. We use our own system, but the disbursement is that results are achieved and a verification process is done. So one of the contributions is that they are going to strengthen our institutional infrastructure arrangement so that, and it becomes more sustainable, because even government gets used to funding statistical activities. So the whole issue of engagement and coordination is a challenge, but it's continuous engagement. We engage so that we have forums where we are discussing statistical activities. What is it that we are doing? For example, like now we are planning for the next census, for example. So we call upon the donor community. We explain to them, this is where we are, these are the gaps, and these are the areas that we would require more support. That one, or that way, we normally try to avoid the overlaps. But it is not easy, because most people do not like being coordinated.
Well, the donor community is right here, so let's hear from them on that point about not wanting to be herded. That's sort of at odds with what you've both said, so why don't I give you a chance to respond to those points?
Should I come in on this one? I think it speaks to the bell at the ball point that, in a sense, donors want to get credit for putting money in, and that means that we end up putting money into our own resources to measure what's attributable to ourselves. So we do need to sort of change the dialogue in terms of how can you shift that. I think a key point about shifting it, if people don't want to be coordinated, is there is poor awareness about the effects of how donors support statistics. So this compartmentalized way of providing assistance, it is very siloed. It's sort of effective in terms of buying some environment results for the program, but it actually undermines the wider systems that national statistics offices are trying to build. One thing that can help is to raise that awareness, and actually good data can help to raise that awareness. So how many resources are actually going in to collecting little pockets of statistics? I think there's a pot of gold of money there. So although Stefan is right, if you put a pot there and say, fill it up so we can fund data, it won't be there. But if we had better information about money already going in, and if we were showing how, actually, if you put that into these systems that can actually have much more strategic, effective data collections that will meet your needs in the round far better, then that's a powerful argument. But to some extent, that work needs to be owned in country. You know, they need to take control of resources coming into the country. They need more information about which part of that is statistics, and donors need to help with that. But that's providing the ammunition, I think, to make the case.
Doesn't that money then need to also be fungible?
It does. That's the challenge. But in a sense, if you can show how things can be done more effectively, then that is a starting point. We're not going to get to perfect coordination, not by 2020 or 2030. But I think if we realize how some of the things we're doing at the minute are doing things in the wrong way, if we actually start putting some of these things right, then I think we can get on the right road. So in terms of the cat might be sending us in the right direction.
Hi, Shanfu.
Yeah, I support what Neil just said, and I won't repeat, but I do want to highlight the point, maybe the necessity that moving forward together, perhaps indeed donors' own M&E approach should also be reviewed and looked at and see what change need to be introduced. Otherwise, it does reinforce the tendency to say, what is my money used for what, and I can measure, rather than looking at the bigger, broader good that we brought to the national statistical systems. And here I want to acknowledge the Data for Development report OECD produced, which clearly refer to this issue, and it's our collective responsibility to break away from that. But here I also want to, again, refer to this recently announced initiative by donors coming together and pledging with scale and with longer-term commitment to do something together. And I think them will begin to form a pressure group among donors themselves, if anyone else want to come in the same area. But what will be their value added, and how it will be coordinated with the already initiated, broader, initiative. Therefore, there will be pressure to really coordinate and demonstrate value added and before jumping in. And at the same time, there has always been this power imbalance, right? Oftentimes we blame on the countries to say, oh, they would like to get when resources is scarce, and they would like to get it. But I think this is very important that countries themselves need to be empowered to see only when donors are coordinated, they get the bigger benefit rather than by accepting the small inflows. But here, just let me quickly return to the sentiment expressed by Neil, this Neil. Indeed, I think at last, the first data forum we issued to the world endorsed plan. And now we're at the second one. This is about how to implement. If we're talking about financing need to be data demand driven, then the Cape Town Global Action Plan need to be really very quickly translated into what is the country plan that is required. Therefore, that can become an anchor for coordinating financing. And on this, I want to also echo what Sarah said. Let's change our terminology. Sometimes it's really what we say, set our mind on it, and influence the rest of the world. Let's not talk about the cost for producing those primary statistics. Let's not talk about funding gaps just because we need to do something. It's really an investment. And what is the down payment we are willing to put in, and how we can generate the flow of investment and allow us to create that most productive portfolio that national statistical system need, but actually it's the government need. So I think it's very important for us to change that mindset by really changing how we refer to it. And the last, I want to indeed respond to what Neil and Stefan have indicated. Indeed, I think the whole UN system, under the leadership of the high-level group of the UN Commission, has come to terms with not only their resolve to implement the Global Action Plan, but also their call for actions from the development partners and donors and so on and so forth. And I think the bank, with our comparative advantage and the role that we have been playing, we stand ready to step up and to support your call. And in whatever form the future financing mechanism requires, we would like to play our part. But here I want to really stress that IDA, with the recent capital increase at the bank, is a big pool of resources need to be effectively tapped into. But let's not forget, IDA is country money. It's money from more developed countries that can be used to help the lower income countries. So don't forget, let's not only talk among ourselves here. All of us has the responsibility to influence how your government will help direct how World Bank would allocate this big pool, a bigger pool of IDA or IBRD financing in the next round. We're happy and we're committed to work with all of you to help position data as a commitment in the next round of IDA resource allocation, so that not only IDA will go into countries, as our Kenyan case illustrated, based on result, but also there will be additional trust fund-based resources allow us to continue to generate the kind of global public goods type of new standard, new tools that we can introduce and support countries to implement so that beef up their own capacity as well efficiency by leveraging new sources and new technology. And so I think it's really important for them to come together.
So maybe the governors of the World Bank could instruct the bank to catalyze a pledging conference or investor conference for data. How about that for an idea? Sarah Lucas.
It's fun to sit here and realize that we actually are all thinking the same things, right? So I've got my notes, and then you say it, and then somebody else says it. But just to underscore a couple of things on this point that Neil and Haishan have both made about, I'm going to just use stronger terms, which is do no harm. That there are funding approaches now with how funders are working around M&E and data collection that are actually doing harm and are huge opportunity costs. So Development Gateway did some analysis recently that calculated about $3 to $4 billion of official development assistance go into monitoring and evaluation, the vast majority of which are standalone project-specific mechanisms for gathering data. If 50% of that went instead to Lisha and Zachary and their counterparts, and those projects relied on government statistics and other official data to monitor their own progress, like we'd fill our gap. You know, so there's a real, I mean, talk about intra-agency coordination, right? I mean, those are coming out of similar agencies, and they're just absolutely working at cross purposes. So we need to be a little bit more outraged by that, I think, and push that agenda. One really reason, I don't have an answer to how we improve the coordination, but one reason I want to underscore why it matters so much is that poor Lisha and Zachary and all of their counterparts do not want to re-articulate to all of us what their country priorities are. They can't meet with us all day long, you know, to explain in different terms to every single funder what their priorities are. There needs to be some mechanism for making those known so that we can all then strategize about how we can fill in some of those pieces where we're best positioned.
But isn't that the mapping project that Niels was talking about, mapping the needs of NSOs? Doesn't it exist already?
Underscore. Well, let me just say that the last thing I want to say is we're spending so much time, as we should, on focusing on how to support country priorities. There are some things that we should not leave to countries to have to do by themselves. And there are some, and this is the Haishan's point about global public goods, but we should not leave each of these countries to figure out what is the right policy and regulatory environment and reforms necessary so that they can safely innovate with privately held data. You can't figure that out on your own. It's too hard. You can't figure out on your own all the methods for interoperability. You can't figure out on your own how to make the case for return on investment. There are some global public goods that can and should be funded that will support all of you in making your jobs better. So that's part of the portfolio here, is not, not just start from the bottom up, but think it is what is the enabling environment that all of you need to succeed and who's tending to those pieces.
Okay, let's just get a quick point from Niels and from Stefan, just on this point about kind of global public goods and data.
I just want to underscore what Sarah said.
Underscored. Duly underscored. Stefan, you've been trying to get in for a while. Let's start with you, Stefan.
No, thank you. This is an eternal discussion. Who should be really responsible for the coordination? The donors or the recipients? I mean, to just simplify it. I mean, the countries, and the simple answer is, of course, both. I mean, we need to work together in a much more complicated manner, but much more effective manner.
Presumably through the UNSD and the UNSC.
We are trying to create those platforms. I think that's really the role that we can play. And because, I mean, I was last week in Bangkok at the SCAP meeting for the Asia Pacific, and this same discussion came up, and that the countries should ultimately coordinate what is coming in. And it was really interesting because then the first speaker was Russia, and they were saying, yeah, we are doing this. And if somebody comes and bullies us around, I mean, I'm simplifying, we are telling them, I mean, to get in line with our national priority. And then right after that, a small Pacific Island country spoke and said, basically, well, it's not so easy for us to engage with the donors. So, I mean, we need to also be a little bit more sophisticated. The situation is different, and I think we clearly need and to enable countries to coordinate better in the sense that we give them tools like the National Statistical Development Strategy, so that and we support these kind of activities. And at a global level, of course, we also have a responsibility to coordinate between all the donors and the stakeholders. And I see, one of the problems that I see is that we need some kind of meta-coordination, because there are sub-coordination loops that function actually pretty well. The OECD DAC committee has a good dialogue between the bilateral donors that are there. The international organizations get together and talk occasionally about how to best support countries in terms of statistical strategies. Perhaps the private donors are a bit new on the horizon. They have not yet really found a place where they are part of that donor coordination. So I think we really need to create a new platform, and that's what I was mentioning that we are trying to do. And to get everybody into a room. I mean, like we're basically doing here. You were also asking what's the difference of before, and I mean, this meeting is the opening salve into that direction, that we get actually everybody around the table. And then my last point, I think that is, we can talk about coordination and better efficient allocation for a while, but we still need somewhere. I did not want to entirely dismiss this idea of a pot, because what keeps me awake at night is that there are some countries where nobody wants to go. I mean, there are some countries that are donor darlings. This is not a very popular terminology, but it exists, where some donors stumble over each other and sometimes almost cancel each other out in terms of their impact. And then there are other countries where nobody shows up. And this is also something where I have to have an eye on, in a way, from a global perspective, to be, and of course the high-level group is helping me. We are not doing this alone in the UN Statistics Division, but we have 22 dedicated chief statisticians from around the world representing very different statistical systems, and I think that's the mechanism we want to use to create this platform of dialogue, to create that list of public goods that we need, that need to be funded out of some kind of common pot perhaps, and then finding funding architectures, mechanisms for different types of countries and different sectors, and not all has to be the same. Like Haishan described with the agricultural sector, and where a group of critical donors came together to intervene there. So if we can take that model to elsewhere, I think that would be very good.
Niels?
Yeah, actually, I don't think I have a lot to add. I totally agree with the things that Stefan said. So the only thing I was reflecting on was that my own country, Denmark, is a part of the European statistical system. And a few years ago, the European Commission decided to appoint a statistical focal point in each country to coordinate statistical production, because in many countries there are more than one institution that are doing statistics, and in order to for them to ask that focal point to report back to them. So maybe something can be learned of the experiences that are from the European Union, and maybe there are experiences in other places that we can learn of, because I totally agree that we need a coordination at that meta level that Stefan was talking about.
Okay, Sarah, you wanted to come in with a quick point?
I
and
just
I'm
wanted to
going come to you,
clarify
Alicia.
one thing here, which is that the Hewlett Foundation's been around for 50 years, and we've had extensive partnerships, including with DFID and World Bank. We have a lot of experience in partnering, and I'd say that one thing that experience has told us is there are many ways to coordinate and collaborate. Pooling funding is one of many ways to coordinate and collaborate. Sharing strategy development, serving on executive committee decision-making panels together. There are so many ways around particular topics. I think we shouldn't be trying meta-coordination across this entire portfolio, because we'll never be able to do it. But there are themes and topics and regions that we can absolutely do a better job, and we just need to think about different kinds of coordination tools, because there are many.
I thought you were about to offer yourselves up as the meta coordinator there for a second, but clearly no. You quick point, Neil?
Yeah, very quickly.
And then Leisha, I'm just going to come to you. Yeah.
Because I think what I see around the room in this World Data Forum is a really good dialogue between the statistics community and wider data communities. 2 or 3 years ago, when some of these initial discussions between these communities were taking place, they didn't speak the same language. Things have moved on a lot. So I think the World Development Forum has started to join up communities. I think, as Stefan says, there are different communities who are organized themselves, but I think there's a need for more dialogue between them. So in a sense, the donor community, I think, doesn't necessarily have a good awareness of some of the things that they're doing and how they can actually best help. So I think opening up dialogue is the starting point for better coordination, and I think that should be something that we should be aiming to do over the next 2 years.
Okay, Lisha Delati-Boudet from Jamaica. In 1 minute, I'm just going to give you 1 minute to kind of like respond to some of the points you've just been hearing about, coordination, efficiency, meta-coordination, or a pledging conference for data. Just take it away, 1 minute.
Okay, so in 1 minute, quickly, we have to be mindful of the fact that one size does not fit all. That's very important. For example, in the Caribbean region, we often refer to what is called the middle income trap. So we're middle income and upper middle income, so our ability to access funding is limited. But we're also very vulnerable. In 24 hours, the GDP of a couple of years can be wiped out with one hurricane. So there are peculiarities to each country, to each region. For example, the issues that are relevant to Jamaica might not be the same issues that are relevant to Montserrat or Anguilla, because these are much smaller offices. So we have to be mindful when you're providing support to statistics that you are mindful of the circumstances that the countries are operating in. And additionally, very importantly, when we're setting targets and goals and objectives and timelines, they must be practical. Oftentimes, there are pre-scheduled things, there are pre-scheduled timelines, you have a project and it must end by a certain time. Sometimes it's just not practical. And we also have to be mindful of the capacity to implement. Quickly, I'll give you an example. We benefited from our project, as in Jamaica, we benefited from our project from a development partner to develop an application, which was a very useful application. It was a technology-based solution. The technology was developed, the technology works. What was not taken into consideration is the fact that the systems that feed into that technology platform are on paper. A paper-based system to provide indicators in a timely basis is not going to happen. So capacity to implement is also very important when we're developing projects and when we're mobilizing funding. We have to ensure that we understand what environment that we're working in and that we are not rigid in terms of how we engage with agencies and countries. I find too often sometimes there is a bit of rigidity.
This is the argument of one size doesn't fit all.
One size does not fit all.
On top of this greater coordination between partners, we have to matrix the individuality of all the countries.
As Stefan said, it's complicated.
It certainly is. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you pause, panel, just for a moment to catch your breath. I'm actually going to invite up Shaida Badi, the Managing Director from Open Data Watch, who has patiently been sitting, listening to all of this, and as many of you will have seen, has been in many of the sessions during the forum and as part of the program committee, I think, for this forum. I want to get your takeaways, really, from whichever's easier for you. Do you need the box?
Yeah, I need the mic. If I'm going to have a voice. Yes.
Does it move easily?
There you go. Okay. No, this is fine. This is fine, I think.
I'm just wondering if the stage manager could come around and just move the box for you to make it easier.
Oh, yeah.
Seems a little bit hefty. Ramsey, come along.
No, then she needs the box.
Okay, she's done it.
Okay.
Okay.
Your question was?
I want you just to kind of bring your kind of, the lens of transparency, which is what you look at all this through at Open Data Watch. Apply this to, what you've heard today, and bring the perspective of civil society to this conversation.
Well, thank you. This has been a really rich discussion. You should see my notes. So I was really interested in all the discussions and hearing all of you, Lisa, Neil, Haishan, and of course Stefan and Zachary and Sarah. Very interesting. Just 5 points, quick points that I wanted to make from sort of listening to all that and trying to summarize it. I've had a very easy task. Yesterday I had to talk about trust in data. Now I have to summarize this amazing set of presentations. So one is that I really think that we have be coming together with an understanding of what is the landscape and also understanding of what are the top priority needs that we have. But I think as I always say, we have to be humble. We still have to do more of understanding and kind of coming to a common sort of set of consensus. On the understanding, the Cape Town Action Plan has helped us a lot in terms of coming together. We've done a lot of, as Sarah said, we have been doing a lot of analysis of the gaps and the needs and so on. And of course, Paris 21 is just finishing up a very important study on feasibility of having a vertical fund or how we can take advantage of the existing knowledge about funding for statistics. So I think we're going to have a very good set of understanding, and we should keep on trying to learn and make sure that we have that. But keeping in mind what Sarah said, that we need to know more about what we don't know, and that is to really, from time to time, to really test us ourselves and put us in a difficult situation of what is it that we want to know and whether the data that we are collecting is actually meeting that need. So since she's told me that, I've been sort of waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking how I can design a system to be able to address that. So it's a very good exercise for us. The second thing is that I heard there is a strong consensus on what needs to change. And I think that change program for us, we have to also keep in mind. And it's really wonderful to see these leaders all coming together and have such a common voice on what needs to change. I was really happy to hear from Niels to put quality of data, open data, and disaggregated data on the top of what needs to change, because we have a long way to go with that. I was happy to hear from, of course, from Lisha and also from Zachary on what we need to do from strengthening NSOs and putting much more energy into it, new skills, and particularly communication, of course, and becoming more efficient. I think that goal is really noble, and it sounds kind of mundane and boring, but I think we really have to set our goal to become much more efficient and bring value for money. But one thing which was really close to my heart, hearing particularly from Zachary, is going with this policy influence engagement, which in some ways is reflecting what Sarah was saying, which is they really, from the donor point of view, they want to see much more portfolio approach. And portfolio approach meaning that you connect yourself to policy, and then you also try to see what efficiency gains you want to make, and how she said using sort of the levers of saying what you're going to do more and less of to meet a portfolio approach and think like a user. So that's really terrific. And the one word I want to say regarding that, as from my point of view, is that it's very important that you invest in articulating your demand. I think one of the things I see different from the past is that NSOs are really strengthening their skills on being able to articulate why they need these resources, domestically or from international sources. So emphasis on articulating demand is tremendously important. And the Cape Town Action Plan, thanks to Stefan and HLG, gives the framework for that articulation of demand. But I think we need to work harder from what Sarah was saying of linking it to policy and having a portfolio approach. So that was the second thing, a strong consensus on what needs to change. The third thing that I heard, which is very quick, but it's very important, so it gets its own space in my 5 points, is the country in the driver's seat, and that is tremendously important for us to keep in mind as a goalpost, but with lots of footnotes, and we've heard a lot of footnotes from you. One footnote was the intra-agency coordination issues and who's accountable. Another footnote was, how can we can't just leave the countries by themselves. There are some global public good kind of assistance and support that we need to provide. So that country in the driver's seat, that doesn't mean you're by yourself and we are hands off until you come and articulate your demand. We are there, and the support system is there for articulation of that demand. The fourth one, which is my favorite, is financing, and the fourth one has two parts. One is, you can imagine, more financing, and the other one is better financing. Unfortunately, I have more things on better financing than on more financing. What I heard on the more financing is that there are good signs on some sectors bringing more money for data, and we welcome that. We've heard it from Haishan on the agriculture, the 50-20-30 initiative. We know about gender and a few other sectors that are getting more financing, and we welcome it. But it comes with some challenges, because we need to, how do we take advantage of building a statistical capacity within a sector? So more financing, we heard that. Of course, we love our new finance and donor providers like Hewlett. You're not new, but you're new in this bigger picture. And please don't go away. And also bring more people, more donors like yourself. And this idea of using IDA that Haishan mentioned, and for countries to really go and make a case for having a share of IDA for statistical capacity building is tremendously important. And we should really count it as, in our world, as new money, even though I know there's a lot of work is underway already. On the better financing, what I heard was really important things. The portfolio approach, we need to do better on that one and bring the users on board. More domestic financing, which is another item on the better financing. More leveraging of IDA, which was another good one. Pooling some of the funds if we can. Using M&E and aligning it better with M&E, because there's so much money that goes to M&E, and building parallel data system is a waste, so we can actually take advantage of that, and more work needs to be done. And very important thing that I heard from this group that I haven't heard before is connecting initiatives when it comes to funding. And connecting initiatives, Haishan mentioned it in terms of CRVS and ID program, for example. We've heard it also a little bit on agriculture, investing so much in agriculture. The gender dimension of agriculture is so important, so we should really think, when we think of development plans, think and connect these initiatives together. So if one has funding, the other can also benefit from that initiative. The final point is going forward. I love Neil saying, you're an impatient man. I'm a very impatient old woman too. So we really need to move fast. And that, in that sense, I was very pleased to hear Haishan saying that she stands ready to help. And I was very happy to hear that HLG is really coming together to articulate the needs for going forward. So maybe we do have something coming out of this amazing panel today that maybe we can move forward with the World Bank offering to help to set up a secretariat for the facility, for the future funding for statistics, and maybe you can even think of a sexy name for that facility. Aishan, you can think of that.
That's a bigger challenge.
So exactly, and you talked in the last section, there's a lot of coordination, the good side of the coordination and some of the sort of careful side of coordination that we could do under this secretariat and facility, and find the balance Sarah, on what is the coordination that we all agree would be beneficial rather than a waste of time. So I think this is terrific. This is very positive outcome of this group and discussion. So, and I'm for one very happy with the outcome. Thank you.
Okay. Shaida Badi, thank you so much. If anybody wanted to understand what this panel was about, we just heard a great summary on it. Thank you. But I have 3 minutes left, panel, so I'm going to give you 15 seconds each to basically just tell me, in 2 years' time in Switzerland, what is the conversation you want to be having about financing and data? Let's start at the end, Sarah. No pressure.
Way to give me notice. I think that I'd at very least like to be able to point to 2 or 3 examples of different models of coordination that we've really leveraged each other. There's a lot of allies in this fight, and let's figure out how to use each other as best as possible. So I'd like to see some real examples of real coordination and that those models look different.
Great, okay. Zachary.
I want also to state that better coordination is necessary, but also something that we've not mentioned about using more the regional economic blocks to better coordinate. the development of statistics in our regions.
Okay, good point. Stefan?
I mean, in 2 years' time, I really want to have this panel have some concrete examples of where we actually made progress. And I mean, all the things that we have been suggesting, having a secretariat, working on certain public goods, and constantly bringing these stakeholders better together. I mean, I want to see that happen in 2 years.
Okay, Neil?
I would like to see the wider donor community more actively engaged in discussing with the wider data community what some of these challenges are and how we can work together on them.
Aishan?
I hope we were no longer crying for more money, but actually deciding on how to best use the money.
Okay, good point. Niels?
I would like to take it even further than the statistical community and the donor community. I mean, the SDGs, the World Data Forum is about the SDGs. The SDG is about partnership. So I would like to see more partners engaged. Sarah said at one point that we should think like a user. I think we should partner with the users and bring them in. I'd like to see private companies and academia and, I mean, the whole world as partners in what we are doing and see them represented in the debate that we have in Switzerland in 2 years from now.
I would like for us to be talking about good examples where there is improved capacity to implement so that we're maximizing the return on investment in statistics.
You come and join me.
Let me. Oh, there we go. There we go. I thought they were trying to silence me because my mic had been switched off. No, there it goes. Yeah. As a communicator, I'm just going to have my 30 seconds here and just say I hope that in 2 years' time we can show examples of the world better understands the need for data and therefore the need to finance better data. Do you want a little go in this one as well? 2 years from now, what is the conversation you want to be having about financing? You literally have 15 seconds.
Well, I wanted to see the same group here telling us, telling us what is the delta, what has changed from today. And I want everybody to see everybody smiling. So that means, reporting on success.
Okay, we have to leave it there. That's a great way to leave it. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Thank you for staying with us.